I will. Okay. Thanks, John. Bye.
Hey there, how you doing?
Hey.
How are your feet doing? Yeah, good. I don't think we're gonna have a full house. Okay. All right, so we are waiting for just a few, maybe we're gonna start in just a minute. And I'm gonna share my screen for the YouTubers. And I'm just gonna give it a few minutes to see if anyone else is able to join us before we get going here. And then we'll go talk about appraisals. Hey, Madison, how are you? You haven't missed anything. I was just waiting to see. No, it's supposed to start about 2, and you're right on time. I was expecting a few more people on Zoom. They're not with us, but you guys are here, and your time is precious too. So we're gonna get right into it. So thank you for being here. It's nice to have live humans to interact with for this. So we're gonna talk today about appraisals. Understanding appraisals. And I call this the Price is Right because appraisals is all about value, right? So, what do you want to know about appraisals that made you interested in this class?
How to search it, like, you know how like sometimes when you're comparing properties.
Yeah. Hey there. Welcome. We haven't missed anything. It looks like we have somebody on Zoom. We're just getting started. So, say that again, Selena. What do you want to learn about this?
But usually just understanding it.
Understanding
Like
it.
I know how the values are, achieved.
How values are achieved. Okay, very good. Madison, what made you interested in this?
I would say the same thing,
Yeah,
just kind of knowing what the process is like, we interact with, and I think there's different ways that they might assess the value as well.
yes,
So
that's right.
The difference between, I think there's like 3 different ways.
That's right.
Is that right?
You learn a little bit about this in real estate school, but from our perspective as practicing real estate agents, it's a little bit different. And so, anyway, we're going to take that. We're going to dive in. Both those are great. So here's what we're going to do in this time we have together. We are going to talk about what an appraisal is and is not, who it's for. Okay. We're going to talk about the appraisal contingency, which is a big part of most offers that get written for buyers in our market. We're going to talk about how to protect your buyer around appraisal issues, things that come up with an appraisal. And the same, how do you protect your seller? What is your obligation as an agent for your seller? And then I want to end with a discussion of appraisal bias, which is a huge problem, has been for years, and then answer any other questions. But because it's just a few of us here in the room and a few of us on Zoom, welcome Zoomers. Please feel free if you're on Zoom or in the room to simply advise, just rate, like, please don't put stuff in chat because it's hard for me to go back and forth. Just unmute and say your question out loud. Okay. All right. So, The first thing is, what actually is an appraisal? It's a report. It's actually a written report with about the value of the property. And at the end of this presentation, you can request a copy of it. There'll be a QR code, and then you can click on the links like this one, which takes us to an article posted online. Everything you know about appraised value in real estate. What is appraised value? How is it determined? Why does it matter? Good stuff. All right. And we're going to get into some of that as well. So, as Madison pointed out, appraisers use 3 different methods to determine the value of property. Generally speaking, there are 3 methods from real estate school. We learned the 3 methods. The first one is the sales comparison approach. That is like us doing a CMA, right? They are going to look at properties that are similar, that have sold recently, and evaluate a value for the property the way they do it, which is different than the way we do it. The second method is the cost method. What would it cost to rebuild the property on the land today? And the third method is the income approach, which is used in commercial property a lot, where they say, okay, this property is worth so much because of the rents it can generate, because of the lease that it can garner. If it's a warehouse, you know, what's its utility for renters or lessees? So those are the 3 methods. We typically, in our world, use the appraisers use the sales comparison method almost exclusively, but they always do a cost estimate as well, and you'll see that in a minute. The thing to know about an appraisal is that it is a snapshot at a specific moment in time. It's dated the next day. It's already the next day. It's out of date, right? Because values change. So the older the appraiser is, the older the appraisal report is, the less valuable it is as a report, especially in the Bay Area market, which is super changing all the time.
Is it the same as a home value report? The appraisal?
Who prepared the home value report? Who prepares that?
Oh, I just,
So there's basically 3 ways that we see home value. Okay, so there's online estimates, which are computer models, okay? There are formal appraisals done by specific people called appraisers who go to get a course, get a certification, right? There are real estate comparable sales analysis, which might be what you're talking about. But if you're just pulling something off of RPR or off of a website, that's just a computer model, okay? And is not really the same thing as an appraisal at all. An appraiser will always be using very specific criteria, which we're going to get at in a minute. But the important thing is, if your client says, I had my home appraised last March and it's worth X, and you know the market has fallen 20% since March, God forbid, 10% since March, you know that appraisal is worth about as much as the paper it's been printed on, the digital space it consumes or whatever, right? It's not worth much. And they have a limited lifespan for that reason, okay? So another thing important to understand is that an appraisal is not the same as a market analysis that you will do and become proficient at. So the way to think about this is an appraisal is a professional estimate of value by an appraiser. And they have very strict rules about how they compare. They can't use all the comps that might be relevant. They can't count certain types of spaces as a living space, whereas you as a realtor might say, of course, that's great living space. Common example is the garage conversion. A garage conversion creates a bedroom. Maybe they put a little half bath in there. An appraiser usually can't count that as a bedroom and a half bath. They have to count it as just square footage. And even then it's a garage square footage, so it's even discounted more. They also, if something was done without permits, and it's very clear, that will impact how they value their properties too. Even if the work that was done without a permit was done beautifully, we might reflect it in our marketing as a beautifully remodeled kitchen and Buyers may not care so much, but the appraiser will be impacted by the fact the work was done without pulling a permit. Now, that's different than us, right? A CMA, a comparative market analysis by us, is the estimated value by a real estate licensee, and it's based on the agent's review of comps and their expertise. Can anyone here in the room or on Zoom say what expertise an agent would have that might make them better than an appraiser at evaluating what the real market value of a property is? What would give you guys an edge?
A pulse
What
on
do you
what
know
the
that the
buyers
appraiser
are
doesn't
looking.
know?
Hi, Stephen. Can you hear me?
Well, they can look that up. That has nothing to do with the value. A real estate agent will know market conditions much, much better than an appraiser might know market conditions. A real estate agent may have been in and out. If you're a neighborhood expert, they may have been in all these other properties that the appraiser is using, and the appraiser only has the sold data. Maybe the pictures have been removed from the internet, or maybe there were very few pictures, but the agents may have been inside that house. If you're a neighborhood expert, you probably know the value of property better than the computer models, or better than the appraiser who comes in, who normally appraises homes in Sonoma, right? So your local location expertise gives you an edge. The other thing is, a practicing agent has a pulse, has a better sense than an appraiser does of the pulse of the market of the moment. They know where buyers are coming from. They know where the hot market is and where the hot neighborhood is versus the less hot neighborhood. Appraisers will only have a sense of that. They won't have the same data. So there's a blog post in this that you can link to about advising the appraiser when they're at the property so that they appraise the property correctly for your client. What to say to appraisers? A lot, but in the right way. Agents should focus especially on inconvenient, low-priced comparable sales. Agents often bring the best or highest priced comps for appraisers to view, but they should definitely bring the low-priced comparable sales too. Appraisers can't ignore those comps. Anyway, it's a good article to read to give you a tip about why you play a role in helping appraisers at the property, which we're going to get at more later. There are some typical discrepancies between the kind of appraisals that we do, as a kind of CMAs that we do, and the kinds of things that appraisers use. And this article talks about that. So for example, let's see if there's a list. Does he actually have a list?
Yeah.
Size. So these are the limits that appraisers have. Appraisers cannot use comps that are above a very strict guideline, bigger or smaller than the subject property. They can't go beyond a certain distance. They can't go across a city or town line. They are not allowed to use pending properties. You guys can. They can only use lot size in a specific way. Anyway, there's a whole bunch of things that is worth reading about that, because that's another way that our CMA provides a value. So let's suppose you're trying to figure out a good price for your buyer to offer, and you call all the pendings, and you find one that's pending that's a good comp that really gives us an idea. And you find out that there were 10 offers on that pending, and it went for this price range. Maybe you don't get the exact price, but you know it's much more than any that it would appraise for. That's valuable information you can bring to your buyer. Appraiser would not be calling all the comps, calling all the pendings. They wouldn't do it. Anyway, so you establish an estimated value. The appraiser might establish an estimated value for the lender. Neither of them is the same as fair market value. So the question becomes, oops, that's not what happened. What happened there? The question becomes, what is fair market value? Anyone have an idea what the definition is of fair market value?
It's
It's-
what buyers are willing to pay
And-
regardless of the,
And the flip side of that,
and sellers
Are willing to-
sell it to.
absolutely. You know, I've taught this class 5 or 6 times before, and you're the first person to get that right, right off the top. Fair market value is what a buyer is willing to pay and what a seller is willing to accept, and that's it. Now, there's an assumption of arm's length dealing here. Does everyone know what arm's length means? Arm's length mean there's no special relationships. So if Madison decides to sell her house to her sister for 20% below market, that is non-arm's length because you have a family relationship there, right? If one business partner sells a house to his other business partner, that's non-arm's length because they have a bond through the business relationship. Those are not what we're talking about here. That's not fair market value. All right. Good for you guys to think about this because you'll be in situations where your buyers are shocked that the seller didn't take 20% below the asking price. You know, then they tried to lowball the offer. Or your buyer bid 20% more than the asking price and shocked they didn't get it. Or your buyer was willing to pay 30% over the asking price and got it well above the comps. Fair market value. So I want to dig in and look at an appraisal report to help you guys understand how these beasts look. So when you see one in real life, you're not like, ah. So these appraisal reports are, I'm sorry to say, haven't been redesigned in 40 years. Okay. So they're still very dense and hard to read. So I'm going to walk you through the important things to know about an appraisal report. The first thing is page 1 is this chart-like thing. The top of it says Uniform Residential Appraisal Report. Now, normally it doesn't have these blackouts. I put the blackouts in to protect my client, right? But it gives you detail, the property address, the name of the borrower, the APN number. That's all at the top. A little bit of the deal the appraiser had. What was the sale price of the property? In this case, you'll note in the second box middle that the contract price for this home was, okay, it doesn't let me do it here, but it was $365. Does everybody see that? $365? All right, that's important. Keep that in mind. Then it tells you about the neighborhood. Then there's a section about the site, and then some general descriptions of the improvements on the. So remember, all real property starts with land, and whatever you build on the land becomes an improvement. So the language of improvement shows up here. That's talking about the actual house. This house has a crawl space. It's got it's got some sort of FWA heating. I think that's forced air. It's got a gas. It's got a refrigerator, range, dishwasher, a few other key criteria. There's a garage. There's a driveway. There's a rear fence. And then it might have a little bit more notes. It describes it as having 5 rooms, 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, and 840 square feet. And then he says, no functional adverse conditions noted. Does the property conform to neighborhood? Yes, that's important, by the way. An appraiser really wants to know that it fits in, right? Is there anything here on this page 1 that tells us what he's appraised it for? Nothing. Nothing on page 1. So if you get the report and you're super eager, what did it appraise for? And it wasn't in the message, you got to go to page 2. So let's look at page 2. Oops. Page 2, another chart. It talks about the comps. Okay, so the subject property is always the second to left feature of the house, subject property feature, and then comparable 1, comparable 2, comparable 3, and then they'll have another page with comparable 4, 5, and 6. But it's page 2 at the bottom that's important. Okay, in the second to last section, it will tell you what the appraiser says it's worth based on what they call the sales comparison approach, which we just talked about. And it's pretty small here, but it says $320,000. does this borrower have a problem?
365.
Yeah, he's paying 365. He's in contract. The appraisal came in for 320. Now, if you think about it, on such a low price point, that's a 15% price difference. That's dramatic, right? So he got 320 by sales comparison approach, but he also evaluated it by the cost approach. How much would it cost to rebuild? And the appraiser said 34440. But he says the greatest weight is given to the market approach as it best reflects the attitude of buyers and sellers in the market. The cost approach is supportive of the sales comparison approach. The income approach is not a reliable indicator of value because of the owner-occupy rate. So at the bottom of the page, here's the money number.
So we're
Karen,
the buyer, right?
It doesn't matter.
Karen,
Doesn't matter. But yeah,
can I
let's
show
just,
you something?
whoever you're representing.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. And normally it would be a buyer. Normally the listing agent doesn't see the buyer's appraisal, but the seller might order their own appraisal independent of a lender. Okay. But here's the money line at the very bottom of page 2 is how much the appraiser is evaluating this property for. And it's $320,000, $45,000 off. Okay. Now there's a lot more to this report. There's this more, there's how he got to the 340 using the cost approach, why he didn't use the income approach, any information if it's a planned unit development, all kinds of definitions, more definitions, the certification about the appraiser and why what he does professionally. The appraiser has to sign it. Then there's some definitions. So in the first part where they describe the property, they use some codes. The codes are defined further on. All these codes for condition, updated, not updated, remodeled, explanation of bathroom count, and then some abbreviations. Then comps 4, 5, and he didn't have a comp 6. He had just comps 4 and 5. And then an addendum where he talks about the neighborhood, the condition, market conditions, comments, why he gave more weight to certain comps than other comps, right? All of this you want to read, especially if your appraisal comes in 45,000 below on a 365 sale price, which this is my buyer from years ago, right? Then there are pictures. The appraiser will go out, he'll take pictures. There's some pictures. And then as you get towards the bottom of the report, he did some pictures of the comps, just the house pictures of the comps. Then he did a plat map. You will see these plat maps in title reports. So when you go to look at a preliminary title report and the disclosure package, you'll see a plat map and they put a little arrow to the house in question. The property in question is that little pink, little red thing at the top up here. So this is the property there. And then there will be, sometimes there's an aerial map. There's a market conditions addendum. Also further justification for why they got to the price they did. He signs it again, then you see his certificate and his insurance. Oh, we're going to get to that.
Yeah.
That's what the whole rest of the class is going to be about.
Yeah.
My point is when you read these things, it looks bulletproof. Okay, it isn't. But it looks bulletproof. And when you read these things, you're not expected to be an expert. Your lender, your buyer's lender, will be reviewing this and may have some thoughts to share. And you certainly can read it and understand it. But your main thing that you want to point your buyers to, or whoever bought the report, is the very bottom of page 2, where the number is. Okay. All right. And I hope one day they choose to update this document, make it a little more user-friendly, because it's ridiculous format for our modern day and age. All right. So for some reason, there we go. All right. So going back, I want to go over with you some general conditions about appraisal, general considerations for appraisals, and then we'll get into the circumstances of the question. So when a buyer is getting financing, whether they're putting down FHA 3.5%, a VA loan, or whether they're putting down 20% or more, a lender usually requires an appraisal. Okay. Usually. The buyer is the one who pays for it. Normally, the appraiser won't go out until the credit card is paid at a certain portal or over the phone or whatever. Some lenders, in an effort to be more competitive, because they can't they want to give a lower rate. They will pay for the appraisal. Many lenders, by the way, will pay for rush fees. If your buyer is in a tight escrow time frame and you need to rush the appraisal, many of the lenders will pay for the rush because appraisers sometimes can take a long time to turn around the appraisal, right? There's a lot of different ways that the bank can get the information it needs around an appraisal, and how they do it depends on the property itself, the terms of the loan, that is to say how much down payment and other things, and guidelines from underwriting. So that is whoever is going to finance this loan. Remember, your borrower's putting up 5, 10, 20%, 80% or more is coming from someone. So in the case of a credit union, it's coming from the credit union's money for giving out loans, or from a big bank, right? But if it's coming from a mortgage broker or a mortgage lender, they are usually have investors that are going to buy the loan right away after it's done. They're going to buy the debt, and those folks have their own underwriting guidelines. They have their own ways that they want to see appraisals done for different types of property. So it always varies, okay? There are lots of different appraisal types, by the way. So for example, when I first started in the business, every time you needed an appraisal, the appraisal would go on site. That was just the way it was. The appraiser went on site. Back in the day, they didn't have their laser pointers. They used old-fashioned tape measures, right? Anyway, but there are actually lots of different ways. The full appraisal. There's something called a property inspection waiver, where the lender's underwriter says, we don't need one. We'll give you a waiver. That means that you don't actually need to have an appraisal. Basically, the risk is so low that no one wants to pay for they don't make the borrower pay for a full appraisal if they're gonna not be it's not gonna be a factor in whether they do the loan or not. That's called a waiver. These are great. I've seen more of them in the last year or two than I had seen before. Inspection-based waivers. All they do is a special licensed property data collector inspects the property just like an appraiser would, but doesn't produce a report, just a property data report. Another one is a desktop appraisal. They say to avoid it in this article, avoid hybrids. Anyway, this article has been, is just an example, but the main two you're going to see are what they call a drive-by appraisal and the full appraisal. So when you are representing a buyer or seller, when you are looking at a residential purchase agreement, there is a term in the contract called the appraisal contingency. And it's an optional term in the sense that the buyer may choose to not use an appraisal contingency or to use one. And it basically says, Mr. Seller, if you take my offer, I reserve the right to cancel the whole deal if the property doesn't appraise for the price that we've negotiated between ourselves. That is called an appraisal contingency. Now, I just said it wrong. It gives a buyer the ability to cancel the transaction if the appraisal is unsatisfactory to the lender. So it may not be the price, as I was talking about this morning. It could be the condition. The appraiser sends it back and says, I can't give an appraised value because there's a health and safety issue or whatever, right? Price or condition. Now, if the appraisal contingency is in the offer, the buyer has a certain number of days after their offer is accepted to take action. So let's suppose it's a 10-day appraisal, and you write this into the offer, or whoever is representing the buyer writes it into the offer. So let's suppose the 10 days, it's 10, and that X is replaced with a 10. Day 1, of your deal is always the day after ratification or acceptance of the offer. So if the offer is accepted on a Friday at 11 p.m., day one is Saturday. Okay. If the offer is accepted at 9 in the morning, day one is the next day. So that's where you start counting. As buyer's agents or listing agents, you want to be on top of this. You want to know exactly when the deadline is. So on that 10th day in our example, if the buyer fails to do anything at all, then the contract is valid until such time as the seller forces the buyer to act. The buyer technically can sit on it and do nothing until the seller forces their hand on this contingency. Most contingencies work this way. Now, we're professionals. We are never going to advise our buyer not to do something on their legal obligated day to do it. But legally, until the seller forces the buyer's hand, the contract is valid. Okay? Does anyone know how the seller would force the buyer's hand? Do you know what document it is?
The-
You're on the right track.
Yeah.
It's called a notice to perform.
Perform.
Notice to buyer to perform. Mr. Buyer, you were supposed to remove your contingency on October 23rd. It is now October 24th and we haven't heard from you. Remove your contingency or 2 or 3 days, or we, the seller, will arbitrarily cancel the deal. That's the document. Yes.
Does it matter like calendar day?
Not for this. Except that an action cannot end on a non-business day. So if you send the notice to perform on Friday of a long weekend, it's still Tuesday. Okay. But let's suppose it's a 2-day thing. It would normally be, I think, 5 p.m. It's either 5 p.m. I think it's 5 p.m. that it expires after the notice is given on the second day. Maybe 3 days. We could look at that. My point is that the seller has a mechanism to get the buyer to perform. And if you are representing buyers, you never want it to get that far. You don't want the seller in control of the fate. You want to take action on it. So you would never allow your buyer to just do nothing. If the seller does force the buyer's hand, does anyone know what happens to the deposit? The initial deposit in the deal? Any guesses? Who gets to keep it?
The seller.
Anyone on Zoom want to chip in? We have a bit of a disagreement in the room. Who gets to keep the deposit if the seller issues a notice to perform and is then able to cancel after 2 or 3 days? Who gets to keep the deposit?
Buyer?
Oh, I can't hear you. I think Priyanka said something. Priyanka, give me a sec. Let me make sure my volume. Oh, okay. Priyanka, can you say that again?
The buyer still?
Yes, you are right. The notice to perform document explicitly says that if the seller exercises their right to cancel, they have to return the deposit. This is another example of how the contract favors the buyer. So keep that in mind. You're representing a seller. You're going to have a long and hard conversation. Do we really want to blow this deal up? Right? All right. So let's assume for a minute that the buyer has a great agent, great Keller Williams agent, and the great Keller Williams agent is going to give them advice about what to do on day 10. Okay, so day 10 comes. Now we're going to use the example of the appraisal that came in at 365 on a 320 on a 365 to purchase price. But we're going to look at all of the buyer's options. So the first buyer's option happens when the appraisal comes in at the sale price. So let's suppose the appraisal comes in at the sale price and there's no problems. There's no health and safety issues. The buyer would typically waive the contingency. They would sign a contingency release form. And that would say, Mr. Seller, I am good with the appraisal. Let's keep going. Let's do what else we need to do so that I can get the keys, Mr. Seller. That all makes sense?
Mhm.
Now, if the appraisal comes in below or has conditions that might concern the underwriter, that is an issue for your buyer. Okay? And so, what are their choices? Oh, by the way, this is a section of the contract, page 5, section 7B, that talks about the appraisal contingency. Because nowadays, our new contract, this changed about 4 years ago, is that chart. We get that chart, and it doesn't really explain what all the things are, but there's a reference in the chart to the section that talks about each line item in the contract. So here's the section of the contract that talks about this. The important thing about this is 7B2. If no appraisal contingency is checked, the buyer says, I don't care what it appraised for, I'm still going to buy, then buyer may not use the loan contingency, if they have one, to cancel this agreement if the only reason for not getting the loan is that the appraisal came in less. They're two distinct things. If the lender said, I'd be willing to do the loan except for the appraisal, you can't use that as a back away if you lift the appraisal contingency but still have a loan contingency. That's important to understand. And C3, the little X for Appraisal Act, we're going to talk about that a little bit later. All right, so the appraisal came in 45,000 low. And there's 3 things that can happen, okay? Number 1, the buyer can waive the contingency and move along anyway. Basically telling the seller, I don't care that it appraised low, I'll eat the difference. And it's a lot of money, as I'll show you in a little bit. Buyer will use own funds. It happens. Buyer really wants the property. Seller, and you may already know the seller won't budge. The buyer, if they have an appraisal contingency, can cancel, walk away. They get their deposit back. Even if the seller didn't give them a notice, they still get their deposit back if they cancel. It's one of the buyer's cancellation rights. That's why the contingency was there in the first place, to protect the buyer, right? Thirdly, they can ask for a renegotiation. And they can ask for a renegotiation in one of 3 ways. They can say to the seller, Mr. Seller, I want you to lower your price down to $320. The appraiser says it's only worth $320. So let's change the price. Or they could say, if the only issue was that repairs needed to be done, they can send a RR form, a request for repairs, so that the repairs get done by the seller or by the buyer, as we learned this morning. But the repairs get done before close of escrow to satisfy the appraisal. Another thing that happens often in this case is an extension of time. Mr. Seller, the appraisal came in a friggin' $45,000 low. We're not happy about it. We're going to be taking steps to deal with that. We need another week on the contingency. Now, for both the change in price and the extension of time, and even the B, request for repairs, what would motivate a seller to be even open to amending the contract? Why would a seller be open to it?
You don't want to put their house back there.
They don't want to put their house back on the market. Absolutely. Why?
Think it, right? Having to go through the process again, losing the time.
Time is money. They've lost time. They have to find a whole new buyer. They also have to disclose that there's an appraisal at the lower price, so they're not going to get a better price anyway. Yeah, all of those are good reasons. Okay, so let's look at how this impacts the money. So when you're thinking about this and you're talking to a buyer or talking to a seller, you need to understand how a low appraisal impacts the financials. So let's take example of $1 million sale price, because I wanted the numbers to be pretty straightforward. Let's suppose your buyer is putting down 10% on $1 million property, which means they're putting down $100,000. And let's also presume that that means they're getting a $900,000 mortgage, right? 10%, 90% financing. If the appraisal came in at $950,000, they are $50,000 off on the price. Does that all make sense?
Yep.
Why is it a problem for the buyer's lender at all that it came in low? Because the rule is that a buyer's lender will only ever provide financing for their portion, whatever that percentage is, 80%, 90%, of the appraised value, never of the sale price. So it doesn't matter what the sale price, if the appraised value is 950, they're only doing 90% of 950, which is 855. Buyer's putting in 100,000. So 855 from the loan plus 100,000 from the buyer is 955. So the buyer is not 50,000 short. The buyer is $45,000 short. The shortfall is less than the difference between the sale price and the appraised value. It's just the math of it, right? Because why is it lower? Because the down payment is still 10%. So your shortfall is strictly on the purchase price versus the loan side, which works out to be 5,000 less than the 50,000 price discrepancy, because that little bit, 5,000 of the price discrepancy is part of the down payment. So the bottom line here is when you're having the discussion with the buyer about the discrepancy, you want to do the math and understand the numbers here. My down payment plus 90% or 80% or 85%, whatever it is, of the loan amount, how much are we really needing to negotiate here? All right, so let's go back. If the buyer requests a modification of terms, like not a modification, an amendment to the contract because of a problem, they can request the seller to reduce the price in part or in whole. So you have a relationship with the agent on the other side and you're having a conversation and you already know that there's some wiggle room there, but they're not going to come all the way down, $45,000 in this case. So you can say to them, what about if we split it 50-50? Will the seller go for that? You may pre-negotiate the whole thing. Maybe you don't pre-negotiate it. Maybe you just send it to them, asking for the full 45 and they agree halfway. So that sort of thing happens all the time because the seller wants to get the home sold, but they also don't want to lose face, right? If there are repairs, you can request the seller to make repairs to satisfy the contingent appraisal, and the seller will granting an extension of time so the buyer can do other things. Now, what might a buyer do if they buy more time? Number one, they can work with the lender to reduce their down payment so they have more cash to cover the shortfall. If they were in a multiple offer situation and they didn't really have any leverage to negotiate, maybe they, instead of putting 10% down, they do a 5% down loan. And then they've freed up some cash to pay the discrepancy. So they can work with the lender to reduce their down payment. They can dispute the appraisal. They can go to the lender and say, this appraiser, he missed a comp that he should have caught. He should have counted this comp. And the lender says, yes, we should write a letter and dispute the appraisal. There's a whole process for that. I would talk to the loan officer and ask them what their experience has been. Does it work ever? Are you ever able to get an appraiser to go back on their opinion? It's pretty rare. Or you get a brand new appraisal. That can happen with certain lenders or with another lender. I had a transaction in 2021, which was non-contingent on appraisal, and the appraisal came in $90,000 below, and they didn't count a comp that we all thought they should have counted. And the appraiser said, no way, I'm not going to count that comp. It's too far away. We went and got a brand new underwriter for a brand new investor who put him in a new loan at the same interest rate and got a new appraisal that came in at the sale price. Two different appraisers, same house, two different values. Deal went through. One closed 1 day late. 1 day late. Everyone was happy. Seller didn't have to lower the price. Buyer didn't have to come up with the discrepancy, and the deal came to stay together. Sometimes you do that. Now, if you're working with a mortgage broker like REMA or an independent, or even some direct lenders, they can usually do that. If you're working with a bank or a credit union that is using their own money, there's less flexibility about that. Am I right? Yeah. There's less flexibility. The brokers have more, and the direct lenders have more flexibility because they have more investors, partners, wholesalers, people they can go to. Whereas a bank and a trust and a credit union, they're lending their own money. So they have their guidelines and they can't just shop it out, usually. So talk to your lender, find out what can be done. Yes. That's fantastic. You know what I say to my buyers? This is great. You got a great deal on this house. Happens occasionally. Yeah, 20. It's not usually a lot though, because the appraiser also doesn't want to go too high for his professional reputation as well. So, but yeah, sometimes we see it and we say, great, built-in equity. It's wonderful. Congratulations. You negotiated a great deal for yourself, or we helped you to negotiate, whatever. All right, so there's an article that you can link to in here about what you can do about low appraisals, which I just sort of went over. It talks about rebutting the appraisal, bring in extra cash. You can change the financing to a lower down payment option, negotiate a price reduction with the seller, order a new appraisal. All stuff that we just talked about. Good article, a little more detail. All right. So you represent a buyer's agent. Here are your best practices. Review the comps with your buyer and discuss the likelihood of a low appraisal with your client before you write your offer. And talk about their options. And the options you talk about with your buyer are not just, do we need an appraisal contingency or not? But if you choose to lift the appraisal contingency with your offer, do they have enough cash? If the appraisal comes in low, even though you don't expect it, do they have enough cash? Do a worksheet. Figure it out. Get help if you're not good with math, right? I would also, if your buyer's going in non-contingent or you're worried about a low appraisal, talk to the buyer's lender. Know before or as soon as possible what the options are available. I would always, as a buyer's agent, contact the appraiser before the appointment and make sure the appraiser knows the neighborhood, because sometimes they send in appraisers who don't know the local area. And that the appraiser has the right experience for the style of property under contract. If you're representing a buyer in a condo and the appraiser's only ever done duplexes, it's an extreme example, but you want someone who's done appraisals on condos. You should try to attend the appraisal in person with comps and any seller improvement lists, because that won't show up unless you tell the seller that the furnace was brand new. He might not notice, right? And there's a blog post about how to share comps with appraisers. If it is a competitive offer scenario, you want to talk about whether you should have an appraisal contingency waiver with the offer or a partial contingency appraisal waiver. So in the contract in section 3L2, you can actually specify a minimum appraisal. Okay, she's early. She's 15 minutes early, so she can wait. All right. Actually, I don't mind letting her in. Let me let her. Oh no, she went away. Okay, never mind. So let's suppose your buyers wants to lift the appraisal completely because they want to make their offer stronger, but they don't have enough money in the bank to cover the worst case scenario. So maybe they say if it's $1 million, they'll go as low as 950 without an appraisal contingency. But if it appraises below 950, their appraisal contingency kicks in below 950. So they can specify a price. Beware, if your buyer is using FHA financing or VA financing, you may not be able to do any of this. You may not be able to do a waiver at all for the appraisal. Check with the lender. Now, let's suppose you're representing the seller, or the listing agent. If the buyer's offer includes an appraisal contingency, you want to talk about this with your seller and about what the buyer might do in response to a low appraisal before you accept that buyer's offer. Mr. Seller, this offer that you want to take has an appraisal contingency. If the property doesn't appraise, it comes in low, or there are condition issues, the buyer will have the following rights, like the ones we just talked about. I want you, Mr. Seller, to be aware the buyer could just cancel. They're not under no obligation to try to negotiate anything with us if we leave this condition in place. As a listing agent, you should attend the appraisal in person with comps and a list of improvements to prove to the appraiser, give them information they may not have from their own resource. And I would also talk with the seller to have a backup plan in place to keep the deal together to help the buyer. So maybe you have a hotshot lender partner you know, who you could offer to the buyer if his lender can't get it done because of the appraisal. Or maybe you have a backup offer that doesn't have an appraisal contingency that you can put into place. There's things to talk about protecting your seller.
Do appraisals appreciate that input from agents?
The better ones do.
Yeah, because
You know,
they don't
there's
feel like you're pushing.
no,
information to them?
they're thrilled to have more data to back. They don't want to dispute. The good appraisers know they want to have the best of, they're proud. They want to have the best approximation of value. They don't want to undervalue the property. Maureen. They don't want to undervalue the property. They want it to be properly assessed. So if you come to them and you give them
If
information,
comps in your.
or not even comps, you might tell them about how the foundation has been retrofitted to the highest standard, and it's a new foundation, and that's that's gonna last for another 100 years, and then you take them downstairs and you show them the earthquake special bracing and everything and whatever. Stuff like that. Appraisers love that stuff mostly because it helps them really determine that the house is in superior condition to the neighbors, not average, which would be the normal default. They might not even look at the foundation.
Yeah.
So stuff like that, intangibles. So that's what you do with your sellers. I want to talk in the last few minutes about appraisal bias. Okay, so appraisers are not exempt from both overt and implicit bias. So first of all, overt bias is, I hate you because of the way you look. That's overt bias, right? I just watched a movie last night I'd been wanting to rent and watch for a long time called 42, which is a Jackie Robinson story. And it had all kinds of racism in it.
Yeah.
But anyway, that's overt, right? But there's implicit bias. We all have implicit bias as a result of the way we were raised because of everything. We're not consciously being biased, but we're always making opinions about others based on the way they look, on the way they behave, the way on our own preconceived notions. So implicit bias is a real problem. And so what happens is appraisers, just like everyone, is not immune from these effects. And what happens is they may discount or promote the value of a property based on the neighborhood it's in, based on the owner's position visible at the time of inspection. There is a very well documented case of an African American family who had pictures from service pictures from military, and the appraiser made certain judgments about the value of the property because having viewed those pictures. There's a report you can link to from here from 2022, no less relevant today than it was those years ago. 12.5% of appraisals for home purchases in Black neighborhoods and 15% in Latino neighborhoods come in below contract price. But if it's in a white neighborhood, 7.5%. That's double. So it's a real phenomenon. I encourage you guys to read this report. So the real estate industry knows this. So there's a whole section in the contract, which you probably never have looked at before, where it talks about something called the Fair Appraisal Act notice and gives you a phone number to call or your buyer or to call if they feel that they've been a victim of discrimination by the appraiser. So the appraiser comes in low, the comps don't seem to justify it. Maybe there's something shady going on, right? This is the number to call. So you guys need to be aware of this too. That's why we advise sellers to remove personal items that could be perceived in a negative way from the listings, right? So, a couple of resources for you if you're interested in learning more about bias. There's a class that Keller Williams teach called The Color of Real Estate, which is a really good course. And you could take that, you can access it from this link. And then there's this wonderful, wonderful documentary called Long Island Divided. It's about 40 minutes long, but it's about an undercover study where these reporters posed as buyers, a whole group of reporters on Long Island posed as buyers and interviewed agents to be their buyer's agent and saw how they were treated, and it was actually very depressing, but shows you that we bring, without even meaning to, we bring our own biases into the picture. It's not on here, but another thing I would recommend you play with is something called Fair Haven. as a member of the National Association of Realtors, there's a great simulator for bias called Fairhaven. You can get to it just by Googling it or by going to the National Association website. And then you get to pretend. You get to have all these scenarios. How would you manage it? What would you do? It's a cool little simulator. All right. We have 5 minutes left. I'm happy to answer any questions. Here is the QR code for you to order a copy of the presentation if you wish, for your own purposes. But does anyone have any questions?
Yes, I have two questions,
Awesome,
Stephen.
go ahead.
Yeah, one is for the appraiser. So it doesn't matter you're a listing agent or buyer agent, and then you are able to show them the comps, right? Because sometimes they
Absolutely.
don't know where is it around, and maybe there's some hiding, that they didn't discover. It's okay for either you are a listing agent or you are buying agent.
I
You can still
recommend
show
it.
them.
Yes. Not just okay. I consider it part of your obligation to your client. It's part
Okay.
of your fiduciary duty to protect their interests, which
Okay.
means sharing the appraisal, sharing your comps with the appraiser. Yes.
Okay, and second question is about the inspection report that you mentioned. So actually, what is the time frame, that we should do the home inspection? I know like if it's 6 months, it may be too long ago and the value go down or something. So what is the best approach for that?
Are we talking
we
about an
do the-
appraisal? Are we talking about appraisal still?
No, I'm talking about the inspection just you mentioned earlier.
I was talking about the appraisal
Oh,
report.
the appraisal. Okay, forget
So
it then.
sometimes a list, and this happens more on the selling side. You represent the seller and they want you to list the property for a price because the property appraised for X dollars, but that appraisal is too old. That's what
Mhm.
I was talking about.
Okay, got it. Okay, thank you.
I have a question too, Stephen.
Okay, Priyanka.
Yeah, so my question is, we talked about appraisals and financing, but whenever I've written a cash offer, the advice that I've gotten from more experienced agents is that you don't really need to have an appraisal contingency when there is no financing involved. I'm just wondering, is there any scenario in which, even if it's a cash offer, you would want an appraisal contingency?
Oh my God, I love this question. I just love this question because it happened to me. Yes, there is a circumstance. So, if you're buying cash and you're representing yourself, then you certainly don't need an appraisal because you're basically saying, I want to pay this much money for it. I don't need someone else to tell me that it's worth that in most cases. It's a buyer choice. But yeah, you don't need one. But let's suppose you're a cash buyer representing somebody else. Let's suppose you're a fiduciary, like a trustee of a third party trust, and you're helping, maybe someone has a special needs trust and they want to buy a house. They're the beneficiary and you're in charge of their money. Then legally, as a fiduciary to your buyer, you want, not the realtor, but the trustee, the person in charge of the buyer's money, that person will normally want an appraisal to protect themselves from anybody saying that they weren't managing the client's money right.
Oh, okay.
That's the circumstance I experienced. But normally, no. Normally on a cash deal, you don't need an appraisal.
Cool. Thank
But
you.
yeah, that's a great question. Madison, what was your question?
I was just go back over the math slide.
The math? Sure. Okay. I've never had anyone ask me about the math slide before. Okay, so in our example, it's $1 million down, 10%, sorry, $1 million sale, 10% down, 900,000 loan, but the appraisal comes in 50,000 less than the sale price. All right. So 90% is all the lender can lend. 90% of the appraised value. So when you take 90% and multiply it by 950,000, you get 855, right? The buyer's putting in 100. So 855 plus 100 is 955. So they're only 45,000 short. They're not 50,000 short. You don't need to negotiate for a $50,000 price reduction. You need to negotiate for a $45,000 price reduction. Okay. Now you could try. You can say it came in $50,000 because there's another side to the point. There's another side. The side is the appraiser says your house isn't worth that much. So Mr. Seller, I don't want to pay. This is really helpful to know the numbers because it implies where your buyer's expense is going to be if they have to bring money to the table. But from a negotiating point of view, you want the whole 50 because the appraiser saying it's not worth 9 million. It's only worth 950. So Mr. Seller, we want the whole 50. But if you get 25, your borrower doesn't have to put in 25. Your borrower only has to put in 20 because they only have to make up to 45. That's the difference.
Okay, I get it now.
So sometimes a seller will say, I'll go down to 30. I'll go down, because they know this too. I won't go down 25 and meet you 50-50. I'm only going to go down 20 because 50, 25, you only have to put in 20, 25 yourself or whatever. He goes, anyway, anyway, it's always a negotiation. Most people don't worry about this. They just negotiate on the price. That's a good question though. So it makes sense? The numbers make sense?
Yeah.
All right. Any other questions, guys? All right. So that's it. It's 3 o'clock. Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you.
And I appreciate you guys being here for this class. I love teaching this class. And I will see you guys again soon.
That should be a year, 2 months.
I'm about to go into a, yeah.
See them?